So, colleagues, allow me to welcome on the floor Dr. Johnson, who will be coming to take us to the next session. Please have your pens ready, your questions jotted down, and then let's engage with her. Dr. Johnson, the platform is yours. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much, Ntate Mekua. It's really my pleasure and my honor to be here. Good morning, everybody. Sanbonani, Molweni. Good morning, everyone. I think I'm going to go straight into my presentation. Let me just try and share my presentation from my side. You can hear me quite well?
Yes, we can hear you quite well. Thank you so much.
All right. So let me just go right to the start. If you can just tell me when you can see the.
Yes, we can see your presentation.
Okay, so thank you so much. I'm going to start immediately because I was trying to practice, to speak only for 15 minutes so that we can leave lots of time for discussion. So Indoda Aikali is actually words that were spoken by or was used by one of the participants of the men's groups at UWC. So when I started at UWC about 13 years ago, I initiated the culture and practice of group psychotherapy. And then one day I was waiting, for a new group to start, and then only young men arrived at this group. And that's actually how I started to be interested, and I started to adapt psychotherapy so that it can be consistent with a male culture. So let me just on my next screen. So my understanding then of men started to evolve, and I began to see that men are in fact emotionally competent, and I started to say this at academic conferences, and then an editorial of mine was published in the Journal of Psychology, and it was titled Men Are Emotionally Competent. So you can go and look up, you can go and Google that and read that. But what I'm going to focus on in this presentation, I'm going to highlight for you some of what, let's call it my own recipe of success, with men. What did I discover and what did I get to practice that can make me say, on public platforms, the opposite of what you usually hear about men. I mean, you've just heard, from some of the colleagues at the men's clinic, and you can hear some of the questions people ask about toxic masculinity. I mean, I get asked that quite a lot, all right, about what is toxic masculinity. But I'm standing here and I'm saying to you, actually, men are emotionally competent. And so in this presentation, I'm going to be quite practical and explain to you some of this recipe of success I'm going to share with you. But before I do that, just something about psychotherapy, because not everybody in the audience is a mental health practitioner. So the scientific literature is quite clear that group therapy is as effective as individual therapy in resolving, in promoting personal growth and development, and in bringing relief from symptoms, because that's what people come for, right? They come to you because they are in some distress and they want some relief. So, and when I talk about a group, I mean under 10 participants. So these are small groups, all right? Let me just show you. This was the client demographics who joined these groups at the University of the Western Cape. They would present with, as you know, in South Africa, there's lots of abuse going on. There's lots of father absence, anger, aggression, violence, all sorts of addiction, sex addiction, substance addiction, lots of, your traumas, your PTSDs, and so on, anxiety. So that was what the men used to present with. But then when they come to the group, we then negotiate and we contract that the purpose of the group here is to get close to the feelings that you usually avoid. And so it's not just men, mind you, ladies and gentlemen, all of us avoid certain feelings, all right? And so the purpose of this group is to come close to those very feelings, that hurt, that pain, that you don't even admit to yourself, the feelings of rejection, you know, the feelings that you actually feel empty, or you feel a kind of loneliness that you can't even express to yourself. So that's the purpose of this group, that you come to get close to those feelings. Why? For all of us, when we go close to those feelings in a safe space, it allows us then to start transforming and understanding what is going on. Because the more you avoid and you drink more alcohol and you take more drugs and you party more, the less you are actually able to get close to what the real, you heard the guy saying, let's go to the root of the problem, because you may be presenting with premature ejaculation, which is causing havoc in your sex life, right? Or you and your wife might be going on and this and that, but we need to go to the root. And when we go close to certain feelings, it allows us to get close to the root of the problem. So that's a little bit just about, just to give you a quick of because obviously it will take another presentation for me to go into the details of what therapy is about. So let me start now with some of the principles of success with male emotions. So the first thing that I do when I meet with a man, consult with a man, or when I do start a men's group, is we don't start with what is the problem. That is not where we start, all right? We start with who are you? And so individual men are then approached as extensions of the cultures that they are from. So we know that on the African continent, we are not just individuals. We are always part of. And so in these groups, then the first thing we do, we first centralize the person, not the problem. So when the participants come into the group, they are prepared in their pre-group instructions. They are told, when you come to the first session, you're not coming to speak about your problems. You are coming, we're going to build a culture. We're going to talk about who you are. We introduce you to what I call the Ubuntu self, so that you can understand first who you are and you bring your whole self, right? So when you bring your whole self in, it means that you come with a whole man, the whole cultural frame. And you can't, in an African context, we see ourselves as socio-spiritual. We belong, right? And part of belonging is rules. And so when men enter these groups, we're quite explicit about the boundaries, and we're quite explicit about what is going to take place here and what will not take place here. And so you can see what I then foreground. We foreground the person, we foreground the man, and I'm talking about a 21st century man, right? Because we may come from traditions that has either been devastated or that has been destroyed, or we no longer identify with our cultures, etc. However, there are certain things that you bring with you about that devastation, about where you come from. So that's the first thing that happens in a men's group, or even in individual consultations. Right. Now, once you have actually affirmed the whole man, it allows you to get to the gender, the masculinity, because the culture then of the man allows you to open up. What kind of gender, what kind of manhood are we talking about here? Because no two brothers are the same. So when you have some men in a men's group, you will have a diversity of manhood in the room. But we know that on the African continent especially, we have been mobilizing men for centuries, and we have addressed masculinity as energy. And so that is kind of the approach, that when I invite men into the room, I am inviting energy. And often the first thing that the men start to do, they start to talk about the kind of men that they are. So once you welcome the masculinity into the room, so that man, when he comes to therapy, he doesn't have to leave his manhood at the door. Because manhood is consistent with emotions. Men are equipped with emotions and an ability to express and feel emotions just like women are. All right. And so the men come into the room with their feelings. And the absence of women then mean that men take responsibility for caring tasks. Men have to deal with their emotions, and they can't outsource emotional performances to women. You see the importance of the fact that and remember, as the woman in the room, I am on the periphery, and the people who are central in that men's group are the other men, because men learn from other men. So when you have these men then in the room or on the rugby field, you can then start with their values. You can focus on their strengths, and you start with what is right with men and not with all the negativities that we are bombarded with. So this is very important, because what I find is that when I start talking up to men about who they are, and we focus on just creating a safe space, they themselves come out and say, but Shahida, I want to talk about this. This is what is making me unhappy, or this is the problem there at home with the wife, or the government at home. And so they start coming out with the problems that has brought them into the therapy. So once you affirm a man's masculinity, you then learn to do things that is consistent with being a man. You're looking at this is a picture that was taken in a psychotherapy session. This guy was terrorizing his family, his nice middle-class family, for years with his drug addiction. What you're not seeing is that he's crying, all right? So as he starts to get close to himself, he starts to get in touch with who he is. And so I've also learned to respect male vulnerabilities. I gave him space. So now he's writing, and I'm a little bit respectful that the man is now at his most vulnerable. All right. And so there's a way in which you deal with male vulnerability that is a little bit more indirect. All right. Another important principle that I've already touched on is that is why, if you look in our history, how men have always been mobilized in groups, because the most important person in that men's group is not the therapist. So as the therapist, I decentralize, I peripheralize myself, and I put in the center the men, because a man looks at another man and he wants to learn from that man, and they tell stories to each other and they correct each other. So sometimes, some guys, perhaps they are not so honest, and then you will find another guy say to him, my brother, you are not believing yourself. You don't expect us to believe you. They then confront each other. So what I do is I set up the space so that it can happen, and so that they have the freedom to be able to address each other in terms of what is being spoken about. And, over the years, what I have noticed is that men bond very quickly and very easily. And over this long period, I've never seen a man shame another man with what is being shared in the group. And I can tell you they share very painful and very deep stuff. So that's just, what I have experienced. So what I also do is another principle that is very important. This is Tsadiso and Fahad. They are previous men's group members, and they have given me written permission. I've got it in writing that I could use this picture. So when I was invited to speak on radio, instead of me going, I took Tsadiso and I took Fahad along with me, and they could speak on behalf of how they feel as men. And so that's also what I do. I allow men to take center stage, right? And then the literature talks about, activity-based intimacy. So talking about one's feelings is a good way of dealing with feelings. But if we want boys and men to deal with their emotions, we must support them to do things together. And men then express themselves while they are doing things. So they may not always speak about their feelings in the way we as therapists, because most therapists are women. Internationally, they are women. All right. And so often a therapist expects somebody to speak about their feelings, and you hear the complaints, you know, and even for us, often as partners and as wives, we say, oh, but he doesn't talk, you know. But perhaps there is another way of dealing with feelings that is not always about verbal. Although I have to say, there are many men who are very verbal, and like I say, there's a diversity of men in the room. And then some men are very good at, and they normally the pace setters, and they start talking, you know. And maybe he's the alpha male in the room, and the other guys see, okay, but this guy's talking about, you know, he broke down or what happened, and he's still a man, you know. So maybe it's I can also do that. Then another principle that I've discovered with men is that there's quite a different way in which men tend to sometimes, or some men tend to emotionally regulate. We might be, you know, speaking about very sensitive things, and it's very sad, and you may then find one guy crack a joke, and the next thing we're all laughing, you know. And I've learned that it's not an avoidance necessarily, you know. It's actually just part of the way some men tend to deal with, you know, with trying to maybe make things a little bit less intense. And then a lot of what gets spoken about in the group is actually about women. I'm actually due to speak, there's going to be a CPD accredited presentation just on the role of a woman in manhood. Because women, that is why we remove women, you know, because women are very powerful in shaping a manhood. And so we literally almost have to remove women so that men can have a space where they can do things on their own terms. And then I can't complete a presentation like this without speaking about ubaba. And in this country, you know, we are a fatherless society, and it is not by accident. You must remember that for centuries there has been direct attacks on our ancestral fathers, and so most children today are being raised by mothers, by sisters, you know. And so that's where the question comes in about toxic masculinity, you know. But I think before we even talk about toxic masculinity, often there's just an absence of men and an absence of fathers. So as I'm now coming to a close with my presentation, because I promise I'm going to stick to it. What I want to do is I want to just quickly summarize the points, the major points about if you want to be successful in your work with men in psychotherapy, you need to learn to celebrate men as fully human. You centralize their personhood, not their problems. And once you affirm them as human beings, because I used to do this even when I worked in Pollsmoor, with sentenced criminals who had committed their first murders at the age of 12 or 13, I still approach men as moral beings. And when I work with men, that I do it in an explicitly gendered way. Instead of asking, you know, how you want to deal with your feelings, I might ask, what kind of man do you want to be? I make the gender explicit. And then I empower the peers, the other men, to be the healers in the room with other men. I take myself out of the center, and then I bring structure and I bring action, and then I work quite directly with power and with governance in the room. So in closing then, I want to say that if we want to stop the war, because we are a society that is at war with ourselves, right? The gender-based violence, even if we look at male-on-male violence, if you must know the amount of men that die at the hands of other men, right? So we are at war. If we want to stop that war, we are going to have to create spaces where men feel safe to deal with their own vulnerability. All right. That is besides the fact that we need to create jobs, you know, and that there must be employment, and that there must be things for, you know, in the way men can develop holistically. And my last slide and my closing slide is this one, that if we only going to focus on the women, and we must focus on women and girls. I'm not saying we shouldn't be focusing on women and girls, but if we're going to ignore men and we're only going to focus on women, it is like climbing to the top of the roof because you want to fix the roof, but you have actually left your tools at the bottom. Thank you so much, gentlemen.